Darren Cavallo ruled the Chicago underworld with an iron fist, his name alone enough to silence a crowded room. He had survived betrayals, assassinations, and a ruthless war that cost him his soul. But nothing in his violent, blood-soaked life could have prepared him for the sight in front of him. Inside the opulent hallway of his newly acquired luxury restaurant, his 5-year-old son, a boy who had not spoken a single word since the day he was born, was clinging desperately to the stained uniform of a cleaning woman. Clear as a bell, the boy sobbed, "Mom." The Grand Oakhaven was the crown jewel of Chicago's dining scene, an establishment of crystal chandeliers, gold-leafed ceilings, and clientele whose net worth rivaled small nations. Darren Cavallo had bought it 3 days ago. For the boss of the Cavallo crime syndicate, real estate was merely a way to launder the immense wealth generated from his less savory operations. He operated in the shadows, but his businesses stood bathed in the spotlight. At 32, Darren was a man carved from cold marble. He possessed a sharp, striking jawline, hair dark as raven feathers, and eyes so chillingly grey they were often compared to the barrel of a loaded gun. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, the Mafia boss was not focused on his illicit empire. He was focused entirely on his 5-year-old son, Leo. Leo was a ghost of a child, small for his age, with a mop of unruly dark curls and wide, haunting brown eyes. He never smiled, never played with other children, and most agonizingly never spoke. The top pediatric neurologists, child psychologists, and speech therapists in the country had been flown into the Cavallo estate. Their diagnoses were always the same: severe psychological trauma. Leo had been born into a nightmare, prematurely delivered on the night a rival syndicate had bombed the safe house where Darren's secret lover had been hidden. Darren had arrived only in time to pull his infant son from the wreckage. The mother's body had been recovered days later, charred beyond recognition. Since that night, Darren had built an impenetrable fortress around the boy. Everywhere Leo went, armed guards followed. "Keep close to him," Darren murmured to his head of security, a towering man named Silas. They were walking through the private VIP corridor of the Grand Oakhaven. "I don't want him overwhelmed by the noise." "Yes, boss," Silas replied, adjusting the earpiece hidden beneath his tailored suit. Further down the hall, away from the clinking of champagne flutes and the murmur of high society gossip, Clara Hayes was currently fighting a losing battle against a stubborn scuff mark on the Italian marble floor. Clara was not supposed to be holding a mop. She was officially hired as a waitress in the VIP lounge, relying on the lucrative tips to survive. However, the restaurant's general manager, a spiteful, power-hungry man named Gregory, had a habit of punishing employees who didn't tolerate his inappropriate advances. When Clara had firmly rejected him the night before, Gregory had gleefully reassigned her to the daytime janitorial staff, citing staffing shortages. Exhausted, Clara leaned against the wooden handle of the mop. She brushed a stray lock of auburn hair from her forehead, her muscles aching. For 5 years, she had been trapped in a relentless cycle of survival. She had no memories of her life before waking up in a crowded, underfunded public hospital with a severe head injury and a fractured collarbone. The nurses had told her she was the victim of a hit and run in a bad part of the city. With no identification, no family coming forward to claim her, and a mind completely wiped clean of her past, the state had issued her a new identity: Clara Hayes. Since then, she had drowned in medical debt, working double shifts, cleaning by day, waitressing by night just to keep a roof over her head in a cramped, drafty apartment. She wrung out the mop, the smell of industrial bleach burning her nose, a stark contrast to the expensive perfumes drifting in from the main dining room. Suddenly, a small, rapid patter of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Clara turned. A little boy dressed in a miniature, immaculately tailored dark suit was running blindly down the hall. He looked panicked, his chest heaving as he sprinted away from the direction of the VIP dining rooms. He tripped over the edge of a thick Persian runner rug, tumbling hard onto the marble floor, right in front of Clara's yellow wet floor sign. "Oh my goodness!" Clara gasped, abandoning her mop. She dropped to her knees, completely ignoring the dirty, soapy water seeping into her uniform pants. She reached out gently, gathering the small boy into her arms. "Hey, sweetheart. Are you okay? You took quite a tumble there." The boy stiffened at first. He looked up, his wide brown eyes locking onto Clara's face. For a moment, time seemed to stand completely still. Clara felt a strange, violent jolt in her chest, a sudden tightness that stole her breath. She didn't know this child yet. Looking into his deep, terrified eyes sent a tidal wave of inexplicable sorrow and fierce protectiveness crashing through her veins. Leo stared at her. His small hands reached up, trembling, and touched her cheek. He traced the faint, pale scar that ran along her left temple, the lingering evidence of her accident 5 years ago. And then, the impossible happened. The child who had spent 5 years locked in a fortress of absolute silence, the child who had never made a sound, even when he cried, buried his face into Clara's neck. His small fingers dug desperately into the cheap fabric of her janitor's uniform. "Mom," Leo sobbed, his voice raw, raspy, and breaking with a heart-breaking desperation. "Mom! Mom!" Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Oh, honey," she whispered, tears suddenly stinging her own eyes for reasons she couldn't comprehend. She wrapped her arms tightly around him, rocking him back and forth. "It's okay. I've got you. You're safe." "Leo." The voice that echoed down the hallway was like thunder, deep, commanding, and laced with absolute terror. Clara looked up. Standing at the end of the corridor was a man who looked like he had stepped out of a dark, beautiful nightmare. Darren Cavallo was frozen in his tracks, 3 massive bodyguards flanking him, their hands instinctively reaching inside their jackets. Darren's eyes moved from the mop bucket to the wet floor, and finally landed on the woman, kneeling on the ground, holding his son. "Step away from my child," Darren ordered, his voice dropping to a lethal, icy register. Clara immediately felt a primal surge of fear. But surprisingly, Leo's grip only tightened. The boy wailed, burying himself deeper into Clara's arms, shielding himself from the man who had loved him his entire life. Silas and the other guards closed the distance in seconds, their presence suffocating. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She knew men like this. Working the late-night waitressing shifts in Chicago, you learned to recognize the predators, the men whose tailored suits hid weapons, whose quiet voices carried the weight of life and death. "Please," Clara said, her voice shaking, but her arms remaining securely around the trembling child. "You're scaring him. He just fell. I was only trying to make sure he wasn't hurt." Darren took a slow, measured step forward. His heart was violently slamming against his rib cage, an unfamiliar panic gripping him. Leo had spoken. His men had radioed in a panic when the boy had slipped away during a distraction in the dining room. But nothing could have prepared Darren for hearing that raspy, broken word echoing down the hall. "Mum." "I won't tell you again." Darren said, his gaze locked on the top of Leo's head. "Let him go." "He won't let go of me," Clara protested, looking up at the towering man. As she lifted her chin, the dim corridor lighting illuminated her face fully. Darren stopped breathing, the world around him violently tilted on its axis. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking as pale as a ghost. His cold grey eyes widened in a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. It couldn't be. Auburn hair, soft, expressive green eyes, the slight curve of her jaw. It was a face that had haunted Darren's nightmares for exactly 5 years, 2 months and 14 days. It was the face of the woman he had buried an empty, charred casket for. It was the face of the only woman who had ever managed to bypass the iron walls of his heart. "Sabrina." Darren whispered the name, tearing from his throat like a jagged piece of glass. Clara blinked, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What? No. My name is Clara." Darren stepped closer, completely ignoring the frantic warnings of his guards. He dropped to one knee right in front of her, the knee of his $5,000 suit soaking in the dirty mop water. He reached out his large, scarred hand, trembling violently as it hovered inches from her face. "Sabrina?" He repeated, his voice cracking. He looked at the pale scar on her temple. He remembered the reports. A bomb, collapsed beams, fire. How are you alive?" "Sir, you're mistaken," Clara said, her panic rising. She tried to shift backward, but Leo let out a distressed whimper, clinging to her neck. She rubbed the boy's back soothingly. "I don't know who Sabrina is. I'm Clara Hayes. I work here. Please, you're frightening both of us." Before Darren could process the absolute impossibility of the situation, the heavy, swinging doors at the end of the hall burst open. Gregory, the restaurant manager, came bustling through, his face red with exertion and fury. "Hey! What the hell is going on here?" Gregory barked, marching down the hall. He stopped short when he saw the towering bodyguards, quickly realizing who was kneeling on the floor. His arrogant demeanor instantly crumbled into fawning subservience. "Mr. Cavallo, I am so incredibly sorry. This janitor was explicitly told to keep out of the VIP areas." Gregory sneered down at Clara. "Clara, you stupid girl. Let go of Mr. Cavallo's son this instant. You are completely out of line. Consider yourself fired as of this exact second. Now get your filthy hands off the boy and get out of my restaurant." Gregory reached down, intending to grab Clara by the arm and yank her to her feet. He never made contact. With a speed that defied his large frame, Darren rose. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around Gregory's throat like a vice. He hoisted the manager backward, slamming him brutally against the silk-lined wall. The sickening thud echoed loudly in the quiet corridor. Gregory gasped, his eyes bulging as he clawed helplessly at Darren's immovable arm. "If you ever speak to her like that again," Darren hissed, his grey eyes alight with a terrifying, murderous rage. "If you ever even look at her with disrespect, I will have my men take you to the docks and slowly separate your skin from your muscles. Do you understand me?" Gregory choked out a pathetic, suffocated squeak, nodding frantically. Darren threw him to the floor in disgust. "You don't own this restaurant anymore. I do. And you are fired. Get out of my sight before I change my mind and decide you shouldn't leave here breathing." Gregory scrambled to his feet and fled to the hallway in sheer terror. Darren turned back to Clara. She was staring at him, her green eyes wide with horror. She was holding Leo even tighter now, viewing Darren not as a grieving father, but as the violent, dangerous monster the underworld knew him to be. Darren saw the fear in her eyes, and it felt like a knife twisting in his gut. The Sabrina he knew had never looked at him with fear. She had known what he was known, the blood on his hands, and had loved him anyway. But this woman looked at him as a stranger. "Silas," Darren said quietly, never taking his eyes off Clara. "Bring the car around to the private exit. Now." "Boss, what are we doing?" Silas asked cautiously. "We are going home," Darren said. He looked at Clara, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "And she is coming with us." "No," Clara protested, trying to scramble backward, burdened by the heavy mop bucket and the clinging child. "I'm not going anywhere with you. I have rights. I'll call the police." Darren knelt back down. He looked at the way Leo's small, pale fingers were intertwined with Clara's collar. He looked back up to her terrified green eyes. "Clara," Darren said, forcing his voice to remain as calm and gentle as a man like him was capable of. "My son hasn't spoken a word in 5 years. Not one. Today he looked at you, a stranger, and called you Mom. You look exactly like the woman I lost. The woman who died, giving birth to him." Clara stopped struggling, her breath hitching. I have amnesia," she whispered, the secret spilling out of her in her panic. "I don't remember my past. 5 years ago I was in an accident, but that doesn't mean I'm her. I'm nobody. I live in a studio apartment in the South Side, and I have $20,000 in medical debt. I'm just a waitress." Darren's heart hammered a violent rhythm. Amnesia. Exactly 5 years ago. It couldn't be a coincidence. The universe was cruel, but it wasn't this creative. "If you're truly a stranger," Darren said softly, "then come with me. Let my doctors examine you. Let me run a simple DNA test. If I am wrong, I will pay off every cent of your debt, give you $1 million for your trouble, and you will never see my face again." Clara hesitated. She looked down at the little boy in her arms. Leo was looking up at her, his dark eyes filled with a desperate, pleading hope that completely shattered her heart. "And if you're right," Clara whispered. Darren's jaw tightened, his grey eyes darkening with a possessive, fierce intensity that made Clara shiver. "If I am right," he vowed, "then heaven and hell combined won't be enough to take you away from us again." The Cavallo estate was a sprawling, impenetrable fortress located on 50 acres of private, heavily wooded land in the affluent northern suburbs. High wrought iron gates, security cameras hidden in ancient oak trees, and armed men patrolling the perimeter made it look more like a military compound than a home. Inside the sleek, bulletproof SUV, the ride had been agonizingly silent. Clara sat rigidly in the back seat, her heart in her throat. Leo was fast asleep, his small head resting on her lap, his hands still gripping the fabric of her uniform. Across from them, Darren sat in the shadows of the vehicle, his piercing gaze never leaving Clara's face. He was searching for familiar tics, the way she breathed, the way she tucked her auburn hair behind her ear. Every tiny movement was a ghostly echo of the woman he had loved. As the SUV pulled up to the massive front doors of the stone mansion, Clara felt a deep, overwhelming sense of vertigo. It wasn't just fear. It was a strange, buzzing sensation in the back of her skull. The smell of the pine trees, the exact shade of the gravel driveway. It felt like déjà vu, heavy and suffocating. "Let me carry him," Darren offered gently as the car doors opened. No, Clara said instinctively, wrapping her arms around the sleeping boy. I've got him. Darren's eyes flashed with a hint of pain, but he nodded, stepping back to let her out. Inside the mansion was breathtaking. Dark mahogany floors, vaulted ceilings, and priceless art adorned the walls. Yet it felt cold. It felt like a museum perfectly preserved and devoid of warmth. Darren led her to a massive private sitting room on the second floor. A few minutes later, a silver-haired man carrying a black medical bag entered. "Darren, what is the meaning of this urgent call?" Dr. Harrison asked, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Clara sitting on the velvet sofa holding Leo. The doctor's jaw practically hit the floor. "Merciful God! Sabrina, her name is Clara," Darren said, his voice tight. "For now, I need a DNA swab. Rushed. I want the results tonight, Harrison. I don't care who you have to bribe at the lab." "Of course," Dr. Harrison murmured, approaching Clara as if she were a ghost that might vanish. He gently swabbed the inside of her cheek, and then very carefully swabbed the sleeping Leo's. "She has amnesia," Darren explained, pouring himself a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter with a shaking hand. "She says she was in an accident 5 years ago." Dr. Harrison looked at Clara with professional curiosity. "Miss, Clara, may I examine your head injury?" Clara nodded slowly, feeling entirely out of her depth. She moved her auburn hair, revealing the scar. "Fascinating," Dr. Harrison muttered, tracing the scar tissue. "This is consistent with blunt force trauma. Severe swelling of the brain could absolutely cause retrograde amnesia. If you were caught in an explosion, the concussive force alone—" He trailed off, looking back at Darren. "It's entirely plausible, Darren. If she was thrown clear of the blast before the fire took hold, the body we buried," Darren asked, his knuckles white around his glass. "Dental records were manipulated, perhaps," Dr. Harrison said grimly. "In our line of work, Darren, you know as well as I do that bodies can be swapped, records can be bought." Clara's head was spinning. Explosions. Buried bodies. What kind of people are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What is this line of work?" Darren set his glass down. He walked over to her, crouching down so they were at eye level. "I am a man who has made many enemies, Clara. Men who would do anything to hurt me. 5 years ago, I thought they had succeeded in taking the only 2 things that ever mattered to me." He reached out gently, brushing a thumb across Leo's sleeping cheek. "I thought my son was dead. And when I found him in the rubble, I thought his mother was gone forever." Before Clara could respond, the heavy oak doors of the sitting room swung open. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels echoed on the hardwood floor. A woman strode into the room. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, razor-sharp cheekbones, and a red silk dress that hugged every curve. This was Victoria Beaumont, the daughter of the powerful Beaumont crime family in New York. Victoria had been sent to Chicago a year ago to forge a permanent alliance with the Cavallo Syndicate. She and Darren were officially engaged, a ruthless, loveless business transaction designed to merge their empires. "Darren, darling," Victoria purred, her eyes scanning the room. "The guards are in an absolute frenzy downstairs. Silas is barking orders about securing the perimeter. What on earth is going—" Victoria stopped. Her ice-blue eyes landed on Clara. For a fraction of a second, Clara saw something flash in Victoria's eyes. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't the shocked recognition that Dr. Harrison or Darren had displayed. It was raw, unfiltered panic. But it vanished so quickly, Clara thought she might have imagined it replaced instantly by a mask of cold haughtiness. "Who is this trash?" Victoria demanded, her lip curling in disgust as she took in Clara's damp-stained janitorial uniform. "And why is she holding your son? You know I don't allow the help on the upper floors." Darren stood up his massive frame, shielding Clara and Leo from Victoria's view. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Watch your tone, Victoria," Darren said, his voice a lethal, vibrating threat. "You do not give orders in my home, and you certainly do not speak to her that way." Victoria crossed her arms, a mocking smile playing on her lips. "Darren, have you lost your mind? You brought a cleaning lady into our home. Need I remind you, we have a gala to attend this weekend. My father is flying in from New York. We don't have time for whatever charity project this is." "Get out," Darren commanded. Victoria's smile vanished. "Excuse me," I said, "get out. Go back to the guest wing. Do not come out until I send for you." Darren's eyes were dead devoid of any human emotion. It was the look of the ruthless mob boss, the man who ordered executions without a second thought. Victoria swallowed hard, her arrogant facade cracking. She cast one last venomous glare at Clara before turning on her heel and marching out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Clara shuddered. She didn't seem surprised to see me," Clara whispered, the realization slowly dawn on her. "Everyone else looked at me like a ghost. She just looked angry." Darren turned back to her, his brow furrowed. "Victoria didn't know Sabrina. They never met. Victoria only came into my life a year ago." "Maybe," Clara said softly. "But she looked at me like she knew exactly who I was. And she looked terrified." Suddenly, Leo stirred in Clara's arms. He blinked, his big brown eyes open, looking up at the unfamiliar ceiling. He began to whimper, the panic returning, as he realized he wasn't in the restaurant anymore. "Shh, shh, it's okay," Clara murmured instinctively. Without thinking, she began to hum. It was a melody she often hummed to herself when she was stressed, a tune she had known since she woke up in the hospital 5 years ago. "Hush now, my little bird, the storm is passing by. Close your eyes and rest your wings beneath the twilight sky." The sound of the glass shattering against the hardwood floor made Clara jump. She looked up. Darren had backed away from her, his chest heaving, his face contorted in an expression of absolute, devastating heartbreak. The crystal glass he had been holding was shattered in 100 pieces at his feet. "Where did you learn that song?" Darren demanded, his voice trembling so violently he sounded like he was tearing apart from the inside out. Clara shrank back. I don't know. It's just a lullaby. It's been in my head for years." Tears, hot and unyielding, welled up in the eyes of the most dangerous man in Chicago. Darren fell to his knees amid the shattered glass, not even feeling the sharp shards cutting into his tailored pants. "I wrote that song." Darren choked out tears, finally spilling over his dark lashes. "I wrote it for you on an acoustic guitar in a tiny apartment in Verona. Long before I had an empire. I sang it to you every night when you were pregnant. No one else in the entire world knows that melody. No one." Clara's breath hitched. Suddenly, a blinding pain shot through her temples. She closed her eyes tightly. A flash of a small, sunlit apartment. The smell of fresh basil and expensive cologne. A man laughing, his dark hair falling into his grey eyes as he strummed a guitar. Darren. Clara gasped the name falling from her lips before she could stop it. Darren's head snapped up, hope blazing in his eyes like a dying sun reigniting. Before either of them could speak another word, Silas burst into the room, his gun drawn, his face pale. "Boss," Silas said, completely ignoring the shattered glass and the emotional scene. "We have a massive problem. The lab courier we sent Dr. Harrison's samples with his car was just found flipped on the interstate. The courier is dead, and the DNA swabs, they're gone." The silence in the opulent sitting room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Silas's words hung in the air like executioner's blades. "The courier is dead. The DNA swabs are gone." Darren slowly rose from the floor, ignoring the shards of crystal embedded in his trousers. The heartbroken, vulnerable man who had been weeping on the floor mere seconds ago vanished. In his place stood the Don of the Cavallo Syndicate, a man made of ice and refined cruelty. His grey eyes hardened into flat, unreadable slates. "Who knew the route?" Darren asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried a lethal frequency. "Only me, Dr. Harrison, and the gate guards," Silas replied, his jaw clenched tight. "And whoever might have been listening outside this door." Darren's gaze flicked toward the heavy oak doors where Victoria Beaumont had stood just 10 minutes prior. He didn't need a confession. The timeline was too perfect, the strike too precise. The Beaumont family had deep pockets and assassins who operated like ghosts. Victoria had panicked upon seeing Clara, and within minutes, the only biological proof of Clara's true identity had been violently erased. "Lock down the estate," Darren ordered, his tone glacial. "No one enters, no one leaves. Not the staff, not the guards. Confiscate all cell phones. If anyone objects, shoot them in the leg and lock them in the cellar." "Yes, boss." Silas nodded immediately, turning on his heel and barking orders into his radio as he marched down the hallway. Clara sat frozen on the velvet sofa, her arms wrapped protectively around Leo. The little boy was wide awake now, sensing the violent shift in the room's atmosphere. He buried his face in Clara's neck, his small hands clutching her collar. "A man is dead," Clara whispered, the reality of her new surroundings crashing down on her. "Because of me. Because of a medical test." Darren crossed the room and knelt before her again. He reached out his large, scarred hands, gently resting over hers. "No," he said firmly. "Because of me. Because I allowed snakes into my home. You are not to blame for the violence of my world, Sabrina." "My name is Clara," she said, though her voice lacked its previous conviction. The lullaby still echoed in her mind, the blinding flash of a memory. A sunlit room, his laugh, the smell of basil was tearing down the walls of her amnesia, brick by brick. "Okay. Clara," Darren conceded softly, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. "I need to move you and Leo to the safe room in the sub-basement. It's a reinforced bunker. Only Silas and I know the access codes. Until I find out exactly how deep this betrayal runs, I cannot risk you being exposed in the main house." "What about her?" Clara asked, her green eyes wide. "Victoria." She looked at me like she wanted me dead. If Victoria had a hand in the explosion 5 years ago, or in the hit on the courier tonight, she will not live to see the sunrise, Darren stated matter-of-factly. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple guarantee. He stood up and effortlessly lifted Leo into his arms. For the first time in his life, Leo didn't resist his father's touch, though he kept his dark eyes locked anxiously on Clara, reaching a hand out toward her. Clara stood up immediately, taking the boy's small hand in hers. Together they moved through the hidden corridors of the Lake Forest estate. Darren pressed his hand against a biometric scanner, hidden behind a 19th-century oil painting in his private study. A heavy steel door hissed open, revealing a stark, brilliantly lit concrete stairwell. The safe room was more like a luxury subterranean apartment. It had a fully stocked kitchen, plush bedding, and a wall of security monitors displaying every camera angle of the estate. "I have to go back up," Darren said, setting Leo down on the massive leather couch. "I have a rat to catch." "Darren, wait," Clara called out, before he could turn the heavy vault handle. He stopped, turning back to look at her. The way she said his name with that soft, hesitant inflection made his chest ache. "The explosion," Clara said, pressing her fingers against her temples as a sharp migraine bloomed behind her eyes. 5 years ago. I remember heat. I remember being trapped under something heavy. But before that, before the fire, she squeezed her eyes shut, crying out softly as the mental block fought her. Darren was at her side in an instant, gripping her shoulders. "Don't force it. Dr. Harrison said the trauma—" "No, I have to," Clara gasped, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. "I remember a voice, a woman's voice. She was standing over me while I was bleeding on the floor. She took something from me." Darren's blood ran cold. "What did she take?" Clara looked down at her bare hands, rubbing her left ring finger. "A ring, a diamond with a sapphire halo." Darren stopped breathing. The engagement ring he had custom-designed for Sabrina in Antwerp. The ring the forensics team claimed had melted in the inferno. "Stay here," Darren whispered, his eyes burning with a terrifying absolute fury. "Do not open this door for anyone but me." Upstairs, the mansion was a hive of chaotic tension. Silas's men had successfully locked down the perimeter, and the confiscated phones were piled high on the dining room's mahogany table. Darren strode into the grand foyer, just as the massive front doors were hauled open by his guards. Standing on the threshold, flanked by 6 heavily armed New York enforcers, was Richard Beaumont. Richard was in his late 60s, a man whose tailored Italian suits and silver hair hid the soul of a butcher. He was the head of the Beaumont crime family, Victoria's father, and the man Darren had spent the last year negotiating an uneasy peace treaty with. "Darren, my boy," Richard boomed, stepping into the foyer with unwarranted familiarity. He clapped his hands together, looking around at the tense guards. "What is the meaning of this hostility? My pilot had to practically beg your perimeter security to let our motorcade through the gates. Is this how you treat your future father-in-law, the week of the gala?" Darren forced a cold, polite smile, though every instinct screamed at him to draw his weapon. "Richard, apologies for the inconvenience. We had a minor security breach tonight, a rat in the supply chain. I've locked down the house to flush them out." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, a microscopic tell that Darren caught instantly. "A rat. Well, that is deeply unfortunate. I hope you handle it with your usual efficiency. Where is my daughter?" "Right on cue." Victoria descended the grand, sweeping staircase. She had changed out of her red silk dress and was now wearing a pristine white cashmere lounge set. She looked the picture of aristocratic innocence, but her ice-blue eyes darted nervously between Darren and her father. "Daddy," Victoria breathed, rushing down the final steps to embrace Richard. "It's been dreadful. Darren has us locked in like prisoners." "Security protocols, my love," Darren said smoothly, walking toward them. He needed to play the game. If he executed them now without proof, the New York and Chicago syndicates would plunge into a bloodbath that would cost hundreds of lives and put Clara and Leo at risk. He needed a confession. He needed them to slip up. "It seems your arrival is perfectly timed, Richard." Darren continued, his voice dripping with false warmth. "Perhaps we can retire to my study for a drink. I have some adjustments I want to make to our merger agreements." While the men retreated to the study, Victoria excused herself, claiming she had a terrible migraine from the stress. But as soon as she was out of sight of the main foyer, her demeanor shifted. The pampered princess act vanished, replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered animal. She slipped into the library, bypassing the guards who were focused on the exterior windows. She moved to the bookshelf, pulling a leather-bound copy of Dante's Inferno. The shelf clicked, revealing a hidden service corridor. Victoria knew the layout of the Lake Forest estate better than Darren realized. She had spent the last year secretly mapping it to feed vulnerabilities back to her father. She knew about the sub-basement bunker. Down in the safe room, Clara was sitting on the floor with Leo rolling a small toy car back and forth across the concrete. Her mind was a chaotic storm of fragmented images. The sapphire ring, the smell of smoke, the sound of a heart monitor beeping erratically. Suddenly, the heavy steel door of the bunker clanked loudly. The biometric scanner outside glowed green. Clara scrambled to her feet, scooping Leo into her arms. Darren had said he would be the only one to return, but the person stepping through the heavy steel door was not Darren. It was Victoria. In her hand, hanging casually by her side, was a suppressed 9mm pistol. Clara backed away, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs until her spine hit the cold concrete wall. Leo whimpered, burying his face into Clara's shoulder. "How did you get in here?" Clara demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Victoria sneered, stepping into the room and letting the heavy vault door swing shut behind her. "Darren is a brilliant man, but he is painfully predictable. He uses his son's birthday for his manual override codes, a fatal flaw of a sentimental fool." Victoria raised the gun, pointing it squarely at Clara's chest. "I have to admit, Sabrina, when you walked into that sitting room, I thought I was looking at a ghost. I paid Detective Kowalski $250,000 to make sure Jane Doe vanished into the public hospital system forever." The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Detective Kowalski. A violent wave of nausea washed over her. Suddenly the memory broke through the dam. She was lying in a hospital bed, her head wrapped in bandages in agonizing pain. A man in a cheap brown suit had stood over her. Beside him was a beautiful blonde woman. Victoria. "She doesn't remember anything," the man in the suit had said. "The doctor says her memory is completely wiped." "Good," the blonde woman had replied, slipping a heavy manila envelope into the detective's hands. "Strip her identity. Put her in the worst ward in the city. If she ever remembers who Darren Cavallo is, I'll kill you both." Clara gasped, her green eyes wide with horror, as the last 5 years of suffering, poverty, and isolation suddenly made sense. It wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a calculated, vicious imprisonment. "You did this," Clara breathed, tears of sheer rage spilling down her cheeks. "You stole my life. You stole my son from me. I did what was necessary." Victoria snapped her finger, tightening on the trigger. "My father needed the Chicago territory. Darren would never have married me if you were still in the picture. The bomb was supposed to kill you both. But you just had to survive, didn't you? Slipping out the back door like a rat." "Darren will kill you," Clara said fiercely, holding Leo tighter. "He'll tear you apart." Victoria laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Darren is upstairs drinking scotch with my father. By the time he comes down here, I'll have staged a beautiful tragedy. The traumatized amnesiac panicked shot the boy and turned the gun on herself. Such a shame. Victoria aimed the gun directly at Clara's forehead. Goodbye, Sabrina. Click. The sound of the trigger being pulled echoed in the small room, but there was no gunshot. Victoria froze, staring at the weapon in confusion. She racked the slide, ejecting a perfectly good bullet onto the concrete, and pulled the trigger again. Click. Firing pins are such delicate things, a voice rumbled from the shadows of the bunker's kitchenette. Victoria spun around, dropping the useless gun. Darren stepped out from the darkness, his eyes blazing with a demonic, terrifying light. He wasn't holding a gun. He didn't need one. He looked like the devil incarnate. You... Victoria stammered, stumbling backward. You were upstairs. With my father. I have hidden cameras in every corridor of this house, Victoria, including the service halls you thought were your little secret, Darren said, stepping closer. His voice was terrifyingly calm. I watched you punch in the code. I slipped in through the secondary egress hatch before you even opened the main door. And I removed the firing pin from that spare pistol you keep hidden in the library desk months ago. Darren moved with blinding speed. He grabbed Victoria by the throat, hoisting her off the ground, just as he had done to the restaurant manager. But this time, there was no mercy in his grip. You ordered the bombing. Darren snarled, his grip tightening, as Victoria choked and kicked wildly. You bribed the police. You stole 5 years of my life with the woman I love, and you just pointed a gun at my son. Darren threw her violently against the steel table in the center of the room. Victoria collapsed in a heap, gasping for air, her arrogant facade utterly destroyed. Darren turned his back on her, rushing toward Clara. He pulled both her and Leo into his arms, crushing them against his chest. Clara broke down, sobbing into his shoulder as the last of her mental walls crumbled. She remembered the smell of his cologne, the rough texture of his tailored suits, the way he had held her when she first found out she was pregnant. Darren, Clara cried, her hands gripping his shirt. I remember everything. I'm Sabrina. I'm here. Darren closed his eyes, burying his face in her auburn hair, his own tears soaking her collar. For 5 years he had lived in an endless, freezing winter. Finally, he was home. But the touching reunion was interrupted by the blaring, deafening sound of the estate's security sirens. Red emergency lights began flashing in the bunker. Silas's voice crackled frantically over the bunker's intercom system. Boss Richard Beaumont figured out we were stalling. His men just opened fire in the foyer. We are under attack. They're breaching the inner perimeter. The blaring of the security sirens tore through the subterranean bunker, bathing the concrete walls in a violent, pulsing red light. Above them, the muffled, rhythmic thud of automatic gunfire echoed through the floorboards of the Lake Forest estate. The war had officially begun. Darren's demeanor shifted instantly. The tearful, vulnerable man who had just found his lost soulmate vanished. In his place stood the apex predator of the Chicago underworld. He stepped away from Sabrina, his movements sharp, calculated, and entirely devoid of fear. Silas! Darren barked into his two-way radio, his voice cutting through the static and the background noise of shattering glass. Report! Boss, they breached the front doors, Silas yelled, the sound of a heavy-caliber weapon firing rapidly near his microphone. Richard brought a phantom crew. They were hiding in the catering trucks parked outside the gates. We have them pinned in the grand foyer and the west wing, but we are outnumbered. They have tactical gear. Hold the choke points at the main stairwell, Darren ordered coolly. Do not let them reach the second floor. I am coming up. Darren turned to the steel table, where Victoria was still gasping for air, clutching her bruised throat. With a swift, merciless motion, he yanked her to her feet by her cashmere collar and secured her hands behind her back with a heavy set of industrial zip ties he pulled from a tactical lockbox on the wall. "Darren, what are you doing?" Sabrina asked, her heart racing as she pulled Leo tight against her chest. The memories of the explosion 5 years ago were fully back, bringing with them the terrifying reality of the life she had just remembered. She knew the violence Darren was capable of, and she knew the ruthlessness of the rival families. "I am going to take out the trash," Darren said, pulling a heavily modified tactical vest from the wall armory and strapping it over his ruined suit shirt. He loaded a pair of Sig Sauer P226 handguns, chambering the rounds with a chillingly loud clack. He walked over to Sabrina, his grey eyes softening for a fraction of a second. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing over the pale scar on her temple. "Lock this door the second I leave." The override code is Leo's birthday, followed by the year we met in Verona. "Do not open it for anyone but me. If I do not return in 1 hour," he swallowed hard. "There is a secondary escape tunnel beneath this floor that leads to the docks on Lake Michigan. A boat is waiting. Go, and never look back." "You are coming back to us, Darren Cavallo," Sabrina said fiercely. The meekness of Clara the waitress entirely gone from her voice. The fire of the woman who used to run the syndicate alongside him blazed in her green eyes. "You owe me 5 years. Do not dare die on me now." A dark, dangerous smirk pulled at the corner of Darren's mouth. "Yes, my queen." Darren grabbed Victoria roughly by the arm, dragging the terrified woman toward the heavy steel door. "Open it," he commanded the biometric scanner. As the vault door hissed shut behind him, locking Sabrina and Leo safely inside the impenetrable bunker, Darren shoved Victoria up the concrete stairwell. The noise grew deafening as they reached the hidden bookcase door in the library. The smell of sulfur and burning wood hung thick in the air. Darren kicked the bookcase open. The library was in ruins, its priceless first editions shredded by stray bullets. Through the open double doors, Darren could see the grand foyer. It was a war zone. The antique chandelier had crashed to the marble floor, and Silas, bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, was laying down heavy, suppressing fire from behind an overturned mahogany table. Standing near the shattered front entrance, shielded by a wall of heavily armed mercenaries, was Richard Beaumont. "Cease fire!" Darren's voice roared over the chaos, amplified by the sheer commanding authority of his presence. He stepped out of the library, shoving Victoria out into the open ahead of him, the barrel of his Sig Sauer pressed firmly against the base of her skull. The gunfire abruptly stopped, leaving only the sound of ringing ears and groaning wounded men. Richard Beaumont lowered his weapon, his eyes narrowing as he saw his daughter being used as a human shield. "Darren," Richard called out, his voice echoing in the ruined foyer. "A coward's tactic hiding behind a woman. A woman who planted a bomb in a maternity ward 5 years ago." Darren spat back, his voice dripping with venom. "A woman who bribed Detective Arthur Kowalski to fake a death and strip a mother of her child. You don't have a daughter, Richard. You have a snake." Victoria was sobbing, her knees trembling so violently she could barely stand. "Daddy, please help me. He's going to kill me." Richard stared at his daughter, his expression completely unreadable. Then he let out a low, cold chuckle. "Victoria, you foolish girl. I told you to ensure the body was burned. I told you to leave no loose ends. If you had done your job 5 years ago, we would have had Chicago without firing a single shot tonight." Victoria gasped, the betrayal hitting her harder than any bullet could. "Dad?" "You see, Darren," Richard said, casually checking the magazine of his rifle. "The Beaumonts do not tolerate failure, not even from family. If she couldn't secure the merger, she is of no use to me. Go ahead. Shoot her. It will simply save me the trouble of cutting her out of the will." Darren's eyes widened in microscopic shock. He knew Richard was a monster, but the sheer cold-blooded apathy toward his own flesh and blood was staggering. "Kill them all," Richard roared to his mercenaries. "Take the house." As the mercenaries raised their weapons, a series of deafening explosions rocked the front lawn. The massive bulletproof floor-to-ceiling windows of the West Wing shattered inward in a shower of deadly glass. Richard's men spun around in a panic. Floodlights from the perimeter suddenly illuminated the dark estate, blinding the New York enforcers. "You think I let you walk into my home without a trap, Richard?" Darren yelled over the renewed chaos. From the darkness outside, dozens of heavily armed tactical units poured through the shattered windows. But these were not Darren's syndicate soldiers. They were wearing black windbreakers with the letters FBI emblazoned in stark white across their chests. "Feds!" one of Richard's mercenaries screamed, dropping his weapon and raising his hands. Richard Beaumont's face drained of color. "You brought the feds into your own house," he hissed at Darren, sheer disbelief twisting his features. "You broke the code. You'll go to prison with me, you fool." "I am a legitimate businessman who was just the victim of a home invasion by a known New York crime syndicate," Darren said, a lethal, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He lowered his weapon from Victoria's head and kicked the back of her knees, sending her crashing to the marble floor. "I tipped off Special Agent Vance in the Organized Crime Division 3 hours ago, right after I noticed your private jet's flight path deviated to bring extra cargo. They have been waiting in the woods the entire time, just waiting for you to fire the first shot." Darren stepped back into the shadows of the library as the FBI tactical teams swarmed the foyer. They tackled Richard Beaumont to the ground, slapping heavy iron cuffs on the screaming, cursing crime lord. Victoria was dragged away, sobbing her white cashmere stained with soot and ruin. Silas, lowering his weapon, gave a sharp whistle to Darren's surviving guards, seamlessly stashing their unregistered weapons into the hidden floor compartments before the FBI agents could sweep the inner rooms. Darren had orchestrated the perfect bloodless victory. He let the government eliminate his greatest rival, sweeping the board clean without getting a single drop of blood on his own hands. The war for Chicago was over. 2 hours later, the Lake Forest estate was crawling with federal agents, their flashing lights painting the stone walls in an eerie glow. Playing the composed victim, Darren handed over Victoria's recorded confession and the blackmail file on Detective Kowalski. He had seamlessly sealed the Beaumonts' fate. They would spend the rest of their lives in a federal supermax prison. Once dismissed, Darren sprinted toward the hidden study. His hands shaking, he punched in the override code. The heavy vault door hissed open. Sabrina stood up, her green eyes wide, and ran to him. Darren caught her burying his face in her neck. "It's over," Darren whispered fiercely, his voice cracking. "The feds took them all. You are safe. You are never going to be taken from me again." "I missed you," Sabrina cried, clutching his vest. "I missed you every single day." A small tug on Darren's pant leg made them look down. Leo stood there, reaching his small hands out to his parents. Darren dropped to his knees, his eyes brimming with fresh tears. "Dad," Leo whispered. His raspy, unused voice echoed in the concrete bunker, sounding louder than any gunshot. Darren let out a choked, pulling his son into his chest. He had waited 5 years to hear that word. Sabrina knelt beside them, wrapping her arms tightly around both her boys. "Mom," Leo said, resting his head on her shoulder. The shattered circle was finally whole. 3 months later, the Grand Oak Haven restaurant was closed for a private event. Clara Hayes no longer existed. Sabrina Cavallo stood by the grand window, wearing a stunning emerald gown and the sapphire engagement ring recovered from Kowalski's safety deposit box. She smiled warmly as Leo ran across the gleaming marble floor, laughing brightly as he chased Silas. The silent, terrified boy was now full of vibrant life. Darren wrapped his strong arms around Sabrina's waist, from behind, pressing a soft kiss to her neck. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured. "A stubborn scuff mark on this exact floor," Sabrina teased, leaning against his solid chest. "And how a mop bucket changed my life." Darren turned her around, his grey eyes filled with absolute adoration. "You changed my life, Sabrina. Twice, sir. I plan on spending forever, making up for the time we lost." He captured her lips in a kiss that tasted of survival and an unbreakable love. The shadows were gone, leaving only a family reunited against all odds. In the end, the darkest corners of the Chicago underworld were illuminated not by the flash of gunfire, but by the relentless power of a mother's forgotten love. Darren Cavallo, a man who ruled with absolute fear, learned that his true empire was never built on wealth or violence, but on the family he had lost and miraculously found again. Victoria and Richard Beaumont's greed led them to a cold steel cage, a fitting end for those who sought to destroy a bond forged in fire. Sabrina's journey from a terrified amnesiac waitress to the resilient queen of the syndicate proved that while memories can be stolen, the soul remembers what the mind forgets. Out of the ashes of betrayal, the Cavallo family rose stronger, proving that no secret, no matter how deeply buried, can silence the truth forever.